Hello, and welcome to another Cloud Podcast, a podcast designed to bring you stories from the smartest minds in IT, operations, and business, and learn how they're using cloud technology to improve business and the customer experience. All right. Well, hey, welcome to another Cloud Podcast. I'm Alex McBratney. I've got my co-host Artie Costaboom with me today, and we are excited. We've got Tom Martin. He is the CEO over at Glance, another customer experience, customer success leader in the market. And we're really excited to have you on, Tom. Great. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
And Artie coming in hot from the West Coast. How you doing today, Artie?
Doing good. Another Monday, but starting off strong. I think this is going to be a pretty good week. Tom, you got to tell us a little bit about where you are right now, because we see the background for all the people watching on the podcast. So where are you?
Right. So I'm down in downtown Boston, supporting a very close friend of mine who's just finished the Boston Marathon. I thought I was going to be in my office, but the timing got a little off. But as technology permits, here we are on the side streets of Boston.
On location. We Alex and I are going to go to a conference probably next week, and we will also be on location. And we got to buy one of those little microphones that we passed around. But looking forward to seeing people again.
It is so great. I was at a conference, went to SaaStr last week out in San Mateo. Jason Lemkin, I think they probably did the best job I've seen in terms of making people feel comfortable, doing a thermal scan, COVID tests, proof of vaccination, and getting in. Everyone felt like things were back to normal to some degree, which was great.
Yeah, that's great. And I think we're all looking forward to that, right? I think this fall is really seen that a lot with just events coming back online and whatnot, but that's great. And I love how the AirPods are noise canceling because you can't hear any background noise. I think it's absolutely great. Technology today.
I know. That's great. I love it.
So Tom, let's just jump right in. I mean, give us a little bit of background of how your career progressed and how you ended up as CEO over at Glance these past 8 years now.
Well, I won't go too much. I don't think people want to hear too much about me. But one of the things I will tell you is throughout my entire career, I've been focused on people and getting to know people, understand people, and also just understand the human element. I spent a lot of time at Verizon Communications. Before then, I had done a number of different startups. But every job that I had involved people, whether it is understanding the marketing side, the engagement side, the sales side. The things that I always like to say is, people want to do business with people they know, like, and trust. And when you can be a company, when you can have people who are on the front lines engaging with customers, how do you want to be presented? And I think that's one of the things that was exciting to me was, when I met Rich Baker, who founded Glance, was this idea of how do we do this in a digital world? We've, for centuries, we've known how to do business, face to face, belly to belly. But now we're sort of confounded by this challenge of the digital world. And people still have a desire to do business with other human beings. How do we do it? And so that was kind of one of the things that got us started, got me excited about Glance. That's been part of this past 8 years.
Yeah, I'm gonna drill a little bit further into it. Tell us a little bit about Glance and what you guys do. What is guided CX? And I looked on your website talking about visual digital experiences. Talk to us all about that.
Yeah. So back in the day, Glance has been around, started a very simple screen sharing solution, but they always believed that if I could simply see what you're trying to tell me, we could get on the same page really quickly. And knowing that as technology really started to evolve, companies were not just getting that information book of like their first website, but more things started to go online. It really became about how do I help people at critical moments? And especially for tech companies that, maybe you think about Ancestry or Airbnb, they don't have a presence. There's no store you walk into. Their entire business lives inside of the website. And so when we started to think about guided CX, we really started to say, you know what, we're a collection of technology solutions that really sort of defines what visual engagement is, which is the ability to be able to collaborate, to be able to see, show, and share, turn on agent video, but to be able to see exactly where the customer is or to show the customer information. The guided CX part is really about recognizing that when you use that technology in ways that can guide people through moments, you realize doing your taxes. Taxes is something that you do once a year, and your life changes, and so does the tax code. So it never becomes something that you become an expert at. You might be an expert at, say, paying bills, because you maybe pay 25, 30 bills on a monthly basis, but there's so many things in life that you just don't do on a frequent enough basis. And we also know that, one of the sad parts about the internet, it's really lonely. And when you think about, like Artie, about like you're going to go buy something, you probably have people that that are like, oh yeah, Tom's my expert. I'm going to call him. He'll know what the right decision is, or be able to provide me that right guidance. So the way we look at it is, sure, there's technology that has evolved into like, here's what the visual engagement stack looks like. The guided CX is really about how you apply it to customers' journeys, because we believe that the best customer journey brings together the human and digital worlds. It's not like, oh, chat's bad. It's really about use chat here. Where should I use a human being? Use the human being here, so that you can drive these outcomes that companies are trying to do. They're like, hey, it's not just about servicing a customer. It's like, hey, we got to drive revenue.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great point. We were having a podcast last week, and a lot of the same conversations come up with AI and how much are people trying to drive the human element out of it, where really you can't take the human piece out of it and completely automate away, because then you lose that customer journey, that hand holding that you can still do. And I like how you're talking about how kind of marrying the two together, right? The human experience with the digital experience. What are some features or use cases on what you've done for some clients that kind of get a little bit deeper into how that looks and feels for either like the customer, like ourselves, or, for the agent?
Yeah. I think one of the classic use cases that's, that you can see on our website is, that TurboTax or QuickBooks. And in the case of TurboTax, this was a company that was saying, hey, you know what, we need to get people to the actual submit button. So they're actually submitting their taxes. And we know that they've got challenges. So this is a classic case where something's changed and they've got a very specific question about some aspect of their taxes. They're not necessarily doing the quick form, they're doing the long form. They've got deductions. They may have like some child credit they're trying to process. And when someone can jump in and say, hey, this is how you want to itemize this information. These are the things that you want to select. Oftentimes, because people start in a digital path, and you realize that, we call it sort of the world of DIY. Suddenly when people are like, man, I can't figure this thing out, there's a level of frustration. And so when you can use a guided CX solution where you can turn on video and say, hey, it's Tom, I'm right here. I'm a real human being. It in fact, in this case, it de-escalates the call, because people are like, oh man, I'm not going to throw rocks behind a tree because I don't know them. When I actually see a real human being who's like, hey, I'm here to help you out. Yeah. One, we can de-escalate the call, but we can be that bridge to say, hey, let me jump in. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to do everything for them. It's really about educating and guiding and giving them a path to take the next step.
Yeah.
In the case of QuickBooks, I'll just give you a quick thing on like QuickBooks. There are so many small businesses. And so this is something we've done for MindBody, for Constant Contact, that we've put up, where you think about, these are businesses that are focused in that in supporting small and medium business. People that often have that sort of that cap. They're the sole proprietor. They have to be sort of the Jack or Jill of all trades. And you realize, I can't do that. So what if I'm working with a business that not only provides me the software or the platform that I'm looking for, but also the expertise? How do I do that?
Yeah, and I remember, I don't know, maybe it's 10, 15 years ago, Amazon came out with the Mayday button for their Kindles where you could hit the button. It was a huge marketing campaign. This was going to be the future of customer service. I think they were too early in the market, and I don't think they had the right idea to be able to scale it to others. And I love how you guys help enable that with guided CX. That's pretty amazing. Talk to us a little bit about the technology tool or the company's architecture and how that differs from other technologies that are out there in the market, screen sharing technologies that are out there in the market.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that are happening, and one of them is many businesses across the universe are like, hey, we want to get away from actually running a client on a computer, because suddenly that means there's all kinds of requirements from the InfoSec team, from the platform team that's managing the desktops, from all the things that maybe create some issue around how it works, as well as in terms of just saying, hey, what if we as a business have to change paths quick? Getting something through our team to be like federated and approved to be put on a desktop becomes really hard, versus what if this is available over the web through a browser. And so we've seen a big shift between client-based solutions and web-based solutions. And the other perspective is, there are things that can be done inside of a business where you have that level of control. But here we're talking about connecting with that end user, wherever they are, on any device, on any browser. And you realize there's some really wonderful technologies out there. But what we're doing is trying to take a look to say, if the premise and our customer guarantee is it's simple, it's secure, and it always works, you really have to sit there and say, okay, how does that drive some of the technology decisions that we are using? And that becomes something like, hey, can WebRTC work? Are there elements of WebRTC that we can work? Or what if we went down and started using things like H.264 for video, and using other video codec to be able to share a screen? Or we have our own proprietary screen sharing solution that can work inside of, say, a mobile SDK that can be ultra efficient. Because the other thing that many of our enterprise clients are really trying to evaluate is, how big is the SDK? We don't want it to be super fat. Will it work with our existing infrastructure? Because one of the things that the three of us could actually build is, we could build a solution that's like, hey, you have to use everything of ours, versus you're saying, hey, we're running this existing contact center platform. We've got this CRM system. We've got this chat platform. Can you make it work with all those things? And that's been one of the drivers is, we can deliver you a lot of stuff, or we can deliver you stuff that can be then snapped into all these other components to really deliver the right solution and journey that you're trying to offer to the customer.
Yeah, and that goes to that keeping it simple portion, right? Like if you make it too complicated and you can't integrate with certain other platforms, and that just becomes an all or nothing, I think it makes it a harder chunk to take a bite out of. Stepping back a little bit, just as customer experience in general and what you're seeing in the market and changes, like where do you see, do you see more companies adopting this route, or is it kind of the bleeding edge right now with adoption for maybe more enterprise because they have the resources and means to, versus mid-market to light enterprise?
I think we saw a lot of people a number of years ago really leading the way. And when we take a look at companies that everyone kind of wants to emulate or is always like pointing to, you look at like what Apple has done with their products, and you look at other companies that you go, wow, this company really gets it. What we experienced was working with a lot of great companies that helped us really drive some of our own vision. But it was in the past 2 years, this pandemic, suddenly took a trend that was already moving forward. We saw financial services, which they don't have a lot of what I would call product feature or price to compete on. Everyone can buy the same stock. Fannie Mae has streamlined the mortgage app. All of these things. So they're like, well, what do we compete on? If you go out and talk to any of the large brokerage houses, they're going to tell you we compete on relationship, and and others. And one of the things that we have to say is, like, Amazon doesn't necessarily compete on price, because sometimes you can find a cheaper price. What they compete on is ease of use. Click that button. The one click is like, look, toilet paper here tomorrow. You can click on things and it just shows up the next day. So what we've seen is, in a world where all of the modalities suddenly shrunk down to one, which was digital, we've seen suddenly companies go, hey, you know what? This was the nudge that we actually needed to really look at how do we accelerate digital transformation. Though, for some was slow, others was already moving fast, but for everybody, it just compressed.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pivot gears a little bit here, because I grew up in the contact center space, tech support space. I actually worked at MindBody Online way back in the day. And traditionally in the contact center space, we think of this type of tool set as like a co-browse or a screen share. And it's usually okay, there's a technical problem, they need help, we need to screen share or maybe take over their screen and help them through a process. Are there other ways to implement this tool set? Are there other pieces of the organization that sees a lot of benefit from this? Talk to us a little bit about how it's more than just a contact center tool.
Yeah, I think what we've started to see is it was traditionally about how do we service or support customers. And I would say it started off with support, then it started to move into service, and now it's really moved into sales, because today businesses are really focused on the revenue aspects. And so to me, the things that we've started to see is it's moved from the back of the house to the front of the house. And so if you're suddenly have all these brokers that are trying to sell, if you suddenly have salespeople that are trying to close people, or a classic is, what if we don't have a sales problem, but what we have is an adoption and a renewal problem, because people need to understand how to use the product, because it's not something that's tangible. It lives in the ether. I think a classic case is like Ancestry, where everyone wants to know your ancestors, but then you get inside, there's like 1,000 levers on like how to build a family tree. And so we've really seen businesses saying, you know what? Yes, one of the byproducts of things like the technology you just talked about, it can improve things like first call resolution, average handle time, and all of those metrics, which I think for smart companies, they really see that as efficiency planning. How do I best staff and organize and run my business? But this has really moved into, how do I take $1 of spend and turn it into $10 of benefit? And if I have people, and this is a classic case of working with a number of companies, I'll give you a mortgage example where you start off with all the digital tools, and these are like the FAQ, so you understand adjustable rate versus fixed rate. Then you go into the mortgage calculator, then you go into the monthly estimator, you have the pre-qualification tool, and you're like, wow, I think I can do this. You hit on the apply button, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, can someone help me demystify the fees? Am I really doing this? And you think about the human condition, which is when the transaction is one that's going to be around for a long time, like, wow, this could be 15 years, it could be 30 years. When my ability to understand alternatives is pretty low and the value is pretty significant, or could be very significant, that's where a human being who could demystify some of that stuff, or be that advisor to be like, hey, Artie, let me just the digital tool gave you 3 great options. Let me tell you, and let's figure out which one's best for you. That's where we suddenly have this intention, which, one of the banks said to us, hey, when people click on the apply button, shouldn't our expectation that 100% click the submit button? Because they've shown intent, but the process isn't easy.
Yeah, I going into a physical brick and mortar and buying something, and they've got, let's say, like a pawn shop, and they got all these like cabinets, and you're like, all right, here are my options, but you really don't want to buy anything until the person comes over to the counter and says, let me tell you about each individual item, and by the way, here's something from the back that you haven't seen, and they pull it out, and so there's that human element that's needed to sales. Although these technologies, much like your technology, it's enabling us to have, instead of just verbal conversations or text in a chat, we're able to actually see what the options are and potentially even present more options. And from a sales perspective, I love that. That's just absolutely amazing.
No. We're working with a company that has a product that gets shipped out to a location that needs to be installed. So you imagine this type of a solution similar to like FaceTime, but in the form of like, hey, let me send you a quick text message. We've seen this with other companies that Salesforce and ServiceNow are working with closely, where you send someone a text message and you're on the phone with them and you say, hey, Artie, just click on the text message and we're going to just take a look at the camera and I can show you like where to plug things in, how to get something established. Once it's online, then we're like, great, we're embedded into the software. Now we can jump in and guide you through how to actually set up something. And one of the things that we realize is that the technology has gone so fast versus the training that people have gotten, and the old world, people are retiring, and so you're like, how do we actually bridge the gap so that instead of thinking of like, wow, we have to hire all these technicians, what if we could have the smart, really well-trained folks back at the home office, and we can have a more junior staff outside, and they can augment it, and technology becomes the augmentation layer in terms of like service. And same with sales. We're watching this with a number of companies that are like, what if we didn't have as many branches? Or what if when someone did walk into a branch, there's a generalist, but if you need to talk to a specialist, you do that via technology. So you still have a point of presence, you still have a human being, but when you have this technology layer, suddenly you can get to the person who can help you out.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I went to breakfast with someone and we were talking about, they used to work at Angie's List, where it's this online repository for all these service providers. And the most common conversation they had was with plumbers, and a junior plumber can only do toilets, let's say. They can't do complex sinks or kitchen sinks, or so they have to do about 50 toilets before they can kind of go to the next level. But with this technology, if they had this technology in place, a small, let's say Griffith Plumbing that only has 50 plumbers, the junior plumber can be on a job site, the senior plumber could be at a job site, the junior plumber can, ask a question via video or via glance and work with a senior and get to that level of education without having someone training them on site and, wasting the senior plumber's time for 8 hours a day in that car. So I think that's just absolutely amazing. And I'm going to piggyback off of that. So are there other verticals that this works well with, or are there specific vertical markets that show a little bit more urgency in adopting these types of solutions?
We've been focused intently in financial services because they were already pivoting there. They already saw this world coming. But the past year and a half, we've seen a huge movement, especially with SaaS companies where their product always needed to be supported. But from really interesting companies like healthcare, you can't go see a doctor. How do I do open enrollment? And by the way, if I don't know anyone who isn't like struggling with like open enrollment, because you're like, why do my doctors have to change? Why do all the selections have to change? You start looking at telco media, where people are like, hey, I'm happy to call and get my happy to change my cell phone plan, but I really want to talk to someone before I make $1,000 purchase on a new iPhone. Because it's a huge purchase. Are my photos going to move over? They've got very personal questions like, what about my files and all this other stuff? Is it just going to transfer over before I like make that expenditure? So telco media. And then interestingly, if you haven't noticed, it's really hard to buy a car these days. One, there's just no cars, but two, I think this is where people are just reticent to actually go into a building. And so if we can extend any types of those experiences, like doing a walk around and showing people, or even like an insurance claim and processing insurance where hey, you don't necessarily need insurance until you need it. How do I effectively process a claim to be able to get that information so they can be like, hey, now we know what to do. So I would say healthcare, telco media, the automobile and manufacturing, the hospitality is starting to come back online. These are all areas that we're seeing pretty interesting traction from.
So that brings up a good question. One of the things that came to mind was like balancing the self-help versus like the guided CX, right? Because so many times you want to offload because the man hours involved with a guided CX cost more. Like already said, if the plumber is the senior plumber and he knows everything, and all the junior plumbers are calling in to get to that one person, it could be expensive. But a lot of people want to push to self-help as well. Like, how do you find that balance, or where do you see your clients taking that balance with self-help versus a guided tool like yours?
Yeah, I think there are businesses that have started to really say, you know what, there are limitations to the DIY, and and some of those limitations is that if we just create too much friction, that can be really impactful detrimentally to lifetime value. So what if we looked at it to say, hey, this isn't a competition between the DIY, but really about saying, what if it's really to say, hey, we're going to help differentiate, and we're going to have the DIY and what we call the DIT, the do-it-together world. So you have the do-it-yourself, and now we're going to introduce the do-it-together world, where this can be a way that we can differentiate. And it's for people that recognize that, hey, you know what, that's one of the reasons that I'm doing business with you today. I always feel like there's an expert. And so what if you started thinking about the do it together is we're going to provide virtual expertise to people. And in fact, maybe we'll charge some level of money for it so that people go, wow, you know what? I'm not just buying the product, but I'm buying service. And that's why I do it. And I think that to me is where we're starting to see businesses start to pivot, which is, if they're always thinking about competing in DIY, that's going to be hard eventually, because that becomes a cost model versus a revenue model. But if you really start to pivot to like, wow, what about the DIT space? That becomes really interesting to us.
Yeah.
When I think about that DIY, I always think of IKEA. You go to IKEA, you buy the furniture, whatever it is, bookshelf. You open the box, and it's like this long self-help type. Don't forget the Allen wrench, and then the this and the that. Sometimes it's really confusing, and sometimes you miss a step or use the wrong bolt in the wrong area. So it could see the benefit of a do it together in those types of instances. It doesn't have to be in the physical world. It could be in the SaaS world. It could be technology driven. I see a lot of benefit to that. And I also see a lot of the times people think of these tools as it's going to save me money. Cost of delivery is going to go down. But in the other way, if you have this as an offering, the DIT, do it together offering, it's going to help you with your brand. It's going to help you with sales, because I would be much more likely to buy an IKEA product if I knew that if halfway through I got stuck, I could click on an app or, use IKEA.com or whatever, do a video, and then someone can walk me through the step that I got stuck. I'd probably buy more from IKEA, and I'd probably still do a lot of the self-help stuff and probably not do the DIT. Yeah. But having that safety net is just absolutely crucial for some businesses.
Yeah. And, we're not saying or have ever said, this is the next solution. This is an augmentation strategy. This is about providing the right blend. It's about meeting customers where they are. And, the thing that we haven't talked about, which is everybody is a slightly different type of learner. And so you go into IKEA, here's the instructions. Sometimes I've wondered, like, did the person who wrote these instructions ever build this thing?
Yeah.
And then you may actually take a look at the video and you're like, yeah, I'm still not getting it, because people learn differently. There's the audible, there's the visual, there's the kinetic. And when you actually bring someone together on that, you realize, hey, that might be something that helps us differentiate.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. Just all the things that that it can do. And, one of the questions we always like to ask towards the end, I know we're running out of time here, is, tell us about a time where you've had a really, really good customer experience yourself. And it could have been maybe even a client that's using your tool, or just in general, as you're out and about buying goods and services from different companies. And sometimes it comes from a bad experience turn good, or just good the whole way. But if you have an example of a great customer experience from a brand that you could share with us, that'd be great if you have something at the top of your mind.
I actually, I have one with JetBlue, and I've been a big JetBlue fan. But what ended up happening was I ended up getting a bag lost. And it was one of those things where I'm like, how does a bag get lost on a direct flight? It was just like a head scratcher, because I'm like, isn't there enough tracking software? And whatever happened, it dropped out of like the tracking, because, you have an app that's like, we're tracking your bag. And I'm like,
yeah,
my bag just like disappeared. And something along this line happened where like the tag got ripped off, and there was, some issue. But what ended up happening was someone actually called me and was like, hey, you're probably looking for your bag. We've found your bag, and we're going to give you some updates. But it wasn't just the digital tool that was guiding me through stuff and maybe making me more confused. But someone called and was like, hey, really sorry, what can we do to help you out? Where are you staying? And we're going to have someone deliver this thing to you. But they reached out to me, and it wasn't me having to incessantly call or stand around the airport. Someone was like, hey, someone's going to reach out to you. And they realized that, you know what, we're going to just jump in and use the human element to close the gap. And I was like, thank goodness someone was smart enough just to say, you know what, we're just going to call them. And you know what, I realized that, when people interject those things, oftentimes you sit there and you're like, I'm going to fly with them again. It's at that moment that you're like, yep, it's an instantaneous decision that you're like, you know what, they just renewed my confidence.
Yeah, and it's such an easy thing for them to do. And when you get it from a very large enterprise like a JetBlue or any airline, it really takes you back. Like, oh wow, they took the time to actually do the right thing and make it right, which is great. And the funny part is, the last guest we had last week, JetBlue, was their comments as well.
No kidding.
Their experience with JetBlue, so they must be doing something right over there.
Well, and this was just I haven't flown like you in 18 months, and it's just been the past month that I've started to fly again to go visit clients.
And with the travel industry, the bar is so low. It's like, get me from point A to point B, make sure that I have all my stuff with me. It's so low, but there's so much runway, no pun intended, for them to over exceed expectation. And to have them do it, 1 out of 10 times, it's going to stick in our minds, for the long term. So definitely a great example.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, well, Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. And I'm glad we had a chance to sit down, because what you guys are doing over at Glance is it's amazing. And I think it's definitely cutting edge and at the forefront of making a great customer experience. And it's only going that direction. And so companies like the TurboTaxes and whatnot that are taking advantage of it are ahead of the game when it comes to customer experience.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Pleasure.
Thanks for having me. And to me, this is the new frontier about how companies are going to differentiate and how they're going to engage customers. Because I think we're now we're pushed across the line where it's not come meet us on our terms. It's meet the customers on their terms. And when you can engage them in ways and recognize that if we do that, we can have great outcomes. We're gonna see this movement continue to accelerate.
Yep.
Yeah. And Tom, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Alex, thank you for being my co-host, or I guess I'm your co-host here on
it goes both ways.
Co-pilot on JetBlue, I should say. Thank you everyone for taking your time out of your day to listen to our episode, and we'll catch you again on the next episode of Another Cloud Podcast.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Well, that wraps up the show for today. Thanks for joining, and don't forget to join us next week as we bring another guest in to talk about the trends around cloud contact center and customer experience. Also, you can find us at adleradvisors.com, LinkedIn, or your favorite podcast platform. We'll see you next week on another Cloud Podcast.